In this video, I'm going to show you step by step how to easily change out the water pump in your truck. And if you want to learn how to fix your vehicle, do budget restorations, troubleshoot equipment, and all sorts of other types of garage related stuff, be sure to subscribe to Midwest Garage so you don't miss anything. Now, the reason you might need to change your water pump out is because the bearings have failed, your engine's overheating, or you're starting to get a leak out of the bottom of the water pump. This hole right here at the bottom of the water pump is called a weep hole, and it's there to show you when seals are about to fail within the water pump. Without that weep hole, engine oil can actually force its way past the seal, and then you'd end up getting oil inside your cooling system. So the weep holes, although annoying, they're there for a purpose, and they can tell you before this actually wears out that it's going to wear out so that you can change it and not get stranded on the side of the road with an overheated engine. Now let's get right into the video and show you how I pulled this out so that we can get the new one in. So as you can see, you barely need any tools to complete this job. The only specialty tool you'll need is a torque wrench. On these trucks, you need to torque down the new water pump to 30 foot-pounds. So we'll use a torque wrench, a 10 millimeter, 13 millimeter, 14 millimeter socket, an extension, a 3/8 drive, screwdriver, pliers or channel locks work, a big adjustable wrench, and a hammer. As for supplies, your new water pump is usually around $60 to $70. That comes with the new gaskets that you'll need. It's also a good idea to replace your radiator cap every so often. I'll show you why later in the video. And also change out your thermostat. You'll also want some high temperature RTV because some of the bolts that go into your new water pump actually seal up water jackets within the engine and you don't want them to leak. Now, before we get started, it is a good idea to, since you're doing this job, just flush all of your coolant out and start over fresh because usually coolant is only good for about 75,000 miles. So if you have to replace your water pump, you might as well flush the entire system and put all new stuff in. This system takes around 4.5 gallons of coolant. And of course you want to mix it 50-50 with water or just buy the stuff that's already pre-mixed. Now, since the water pump is centered on the engine about halfway down, you're going to want to remove the fan shroud to gain a little bit better access to it. So take your 10 millimeter socket and remove the top portion of your fan shroud. So you're going to have 3 10 millimeter bolts on top, as well as bolts on the sides that connect the top of the fan shroud to the lower portion of it. This truck doesn't have a lower portion of the fan shroud because it's over 20 years old and it broke, and I don't feel like getting a new one. Now, you can remove the clips to remove this wiring off the top of the fan shroud, but there is enough room where you can just pull it up and lay it over the engine so that it's out of the way. Now, as you can see, with the fan shroud out of the way, we have all this room to work with to get to the water pump, which is behind this pulley here. So the next step is going to be to remove this clutch fan. Now, they do make a tool for removing the fan, but I don't have one, and it's just as easy to take a big crescent wrench, put it over the threads, and then give it a nice solid whack to loosen it up off the pulley. If your pulley is moving when you try to loosen this, you can grab the 3/8 end of a socket or a ratchet, put it in your tensioner pulley, and move your tensioner pulley clockwise to put more tension on your serpentine belt, which will keep that pulley from moving when you give your crescent wrench a whack. Once it breaks loose, you can remove this and loosen up your fan. Next, you can go ahead and remove your serpentine belt. Do that by twisting your tensioner counterclockwise, which will remove tension off the serpentine so that you can pull the whole thing out. Now, if you don't have a diagram of how your serpentine belt goes on the engine, it's a good idea to draw a quick little diagram. Or a simple rule of thumb is every pulley that has grooves, you put the grooves of the belt in, and every smooth pulley, the back side of the belt goes on. Once you pull your serpentine belt off, you're gonna wanna check it for any cracks or unusual wear. This serpentine belt is pretty new, so I'm not gonna have to replace it, but I'm still gonna look it over real quick, make sure that everything's good to go. If it even has a little bit of cracks in it, they're cheap, so you might as well buy a new one. This one's good, so I'm gonna set it aside. So I recently already did a video on how to check your tensioner pulley. You should definitely check that out because it's really important, especially on these engines. But another thing you want to check out is your idler pulley, which is right here. Just give it a spin, make sure it spins freely and it's not making any noise. Make sure it's not wobbly. This has a little bit of play in it, but it's good for now. So the next step is to grab your 10mm socket again, and you're gonna remove the 4 bolts off of your fan pulley. And you're gonna notice that these 4 bolts aren't torqued down very hard, but since this does spin freely, they're gonna be difficult to get off. So what you can do is just grab a screwdriver and place it between 2 of the bolts so that you can loosen up one at a time. Once your 4 bolts are out, just pull the water pump pulley off. And here's your water pump right here. To gain a little bit better access, I'm just gonna go ahead and remove the idler pulley, and that's a 13mm bolt. And be careful when you pull this off because there's most likely a washer behind it that you don't wanna drop. Right there. Now with the idler pulley out of the way, you can see that we have clear access to these 2 hoses that need to be removed, as well as all 4 bolts. We're going to be removing those 2 and those 2 to get the water pump off. And you can see right down there is where the water pump is leaking from, and it's leaking out of the weep hole. To get these 2 hoses undone from the water pump, you can just grab a pair of vice grips and move the clamps up the hose a bit. And if these hoses are a little bit kind of stuck on there, you can take your vice grips and just gently twist them back and forth to break them loose and then pull up. Next is going to be our lower radiator hose, which is the same type of clamp, and it's down on the bottom passenger side of the water pump. Now when you're removing your lower radiator hose, if you didn't drain all of the coolant out of the system, you are going to get a lot coming out of that hose. So make sure that you have a drip pan underneath to catch everything. Now that everything's disconnected, you can remove the 4 bolts holding the water pump on, and these are 14mm bolts. And you'll notice that these bolts are wet when you pull them out, and that's because they're sealing up a water jacket within the engine. So when we put these back in, we're going to want to make sure that we put a little bit of RTV on the ends to seal up the hole so we don't have leaks. You can see some leftover gasket material on each side. So all I'm going to do is use a plastic scraper. Make sure it's not metal, otherwise you might gouge the mating surface. But use a plastic scraper to clean up those mating surfaces really well so that we can get the new water pump installed. So to get the new water pump ready to install, we're going to take our gaskets, and I'm just going to take a little dab of petroleum jelly and place it on here just to help it stick a little bit. You can also use gasket glue. Either one works fine. And you don't need much of this at all, but I'm gonna line up the holes as best I can. And then I'm gonna take my bolts here and just take a wire brush and kind of clean them up a little bit. And you can tell that the water pump I pulled out of the truck is from the factory. So I'm pretty impressed. That water pump lasted over 150,000 miles and is 22 years old at the time that I pulled it out. So I think it was about due for replacing. And then we're gonna take some of this high temp RTV and we're just gonna put a little bit, I'm not even gonna bother with that, on each bolt, because as I mentioned before, these bolts actually seal some water jackets. So as we thread these into the engine, they'll seal up any water passages so that we don't have leaks with the new one. So now this is ready to go into the engine. So after your mating surfaces are clean, you're all ready to throw your new water pump in. We have our gaskets, we have our RTV on our bolts, and so we'll just set it right in place. And once you get one of the bolts started by hand, it's pretty easy. So after you get your water pump in place and bolts snug down, you want to tighten them to 30 foot-pounds. Next, we'll reconnect our hoses, and I'm going to start with the lower radiator hose and then our two upper hoses. So when it comes to your serpentine belt, you can look on your fan shroud and see exactly how it goes. And then you just want to make sure that your belt is seated on every pulley and you're not riding the edges on anything. Now we're ready to put our fan in. And then same drill to tighten it as you did to loosen it. Put some tension on your pulley. Give it a couple good whacks. After you get everything put back together, the next step would be to change out your thermostat, which is right underneath this housing too. It's just a couple of bolts. I'm not going to go over that. It's pretty self-explanatory. And you'll also want to change out your radiator cap. This is why. So your cooling system is a sealed system that builds pressure. So over time, your radiator cap, which has this gasket, is going to wear out, and also this spring. You can see that it's not very springy anymore. It lost a lot of its retention. And so you want to change it out for a new one, which has a much stronger spring and a better gasket. So you get a proper seal on your cooling system and not allow air bubbles and air leaks into the system, which can then create bubbles or air pockets, which then can create hot spots in the engine, which can make it overheat, and that's never a good thing. So a simple rule of thumb, if you ever have to do work on your cooling system, just change out your radiator cap. They're only $5, so you might as well do it when you can. Now the last and most important step is to use the proper coolant. If your engine is running DexCool, then you have to continue using DexCool, or DexCrap as I call it. So since I didn't replace all of the coolant in this system, I'm gonna throw DexCool back in, and you wanna mix it 50-50 obviously with distilled water. And we probably didn't lose that much coolant, so we're just gonna top it off. And you can hear the air bubbles coming up, and they make a system that is a big sealed funnel that will be the highest point, and so all of the air that's trapped in the system while you're running the engine will actually escape from there. But I don't have one, so I'm going to show you an easy trick to make sure you get the air out of the entire system and properly bleed your cooling system of all the air. All right, so we got all of the air out of the system. It's sealed up, no leaks. The engine's running cool and smooth, so we're all done. If you like the video, please let me know down in the comments below. Give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Midwest Garage if you haven't already. I have a ton of content coming out every week, as well as a lot of past videos that you'd probably really enjoy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.